So thanks everyone for joining this week's instalment of Solidarity over Zoom. We've got a great panel tonight. I'm Caitlin, by the way. I'm just going to be chairing the meeting tonight from the Solidarity headquarters in Sydney. So tonight's meeting is workers' resistance and the coronavirus, fighting for jobs, safety and income support. And we've got three union speakers here to speak with us tonight. Well, not here. We've got one in Melbourne and two elsewhere in Sydney. So we've got Rob Boncardo from Sydney University National Tertiary Education. He's a member of the branch committee there and the convener of the Casuals Network. We've also got Alex Sewell, who's a UWU organiser in Sydney, and Solidarity's Lucy Honan, who is also an Australian Education Union State Councillor. So the speakers will go for no more than 10 minutes each, and then we'll have about half an hour for discussion after that before a brief second item. So Rob, if you're ready to go, I might hand over to you first.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me. So look, I'm just going to talk a bit about what's been going on in Sydney. I'm sure many of you are aware of that, but I'll also talk about maybe the NTEU situation across the country at the moment. So talking from the National Tertiary Education Union and talking about what's been going on in universities over the last couple of months. There are friends and comrades here who are sort of in the same situation as me. So if there are things that I miss out, I'll be very grateful if they add anything. So effectively, the tertiary education industry has been hit pretty dramatically by the COVID-19 situation. Obviously, the massive dependence on international student revenue, the fact that there are border closures at the moment, people can't get in and out, has obviously had a dramatic effect on universities. And obviously, as you've also seen, the federal government hasn't I guess, stepped into the breach as they've done in other industries. It's been quite an interesting thing to see that the federal government let one of the major export industries go through this, and of course also to reject and indeed to tweak the legislation around JobKeeper to stop university workers being able to get the JobKeeper payment. Sydney made an application, and last Friday the government changed the legislation so that we couldn't get it. So it's a pretty dire situation at universities. As is, and I guess what I want to talk about mostly is around the NTEU and the way that unionism in universities has worked, has not worked, in terms of trying to fight back against the situation that we find ourselves in. So I suppose the situation is really complicated because I guess the main thing to understand about the situation the NTEU finds itself in is a month or so ago, the National Executive announced sort of without any consultation with members that they were already entering into, and in fact had begun negotiations with the bosses to essentially to make a number of concessions around possibly wage cuts or allowing employers to direct the taking of leave. In order for the union to sort of guarantee to its members that there wouldn't be things like, there'd be limitations on stand downs, on redundancies and these sorts of things. So effectively what happened was that, this came out that the National Executive was negotiating with the bosses already, and essentially across branches across the country voted overwhelmingly, major branches, including places like Sydney, places like Melbourne, Monash, and many others across the country, voted in overwhelming numbers to censure the National Executive and to say that we weren't happy with the fact that they had begun negotiations with the bosses, and indeed had begun from this position of weakness by making concessions immediately. And so there's been a significant pushback on the part of rank and file members of the NTEU. And that's been in evidence across the country. There are petitions that have thousands of signatures on them, sort of censuring the national executive over that. Now, just to sort of give you a sense of what's going on both sides of this equation. So the national executive itself have continued and have indeed endorsed by the National Council their strategy of negotiation. So essentially what the national executive wants to do is to negotiate with vice chancellors to put in place what the NTEU is calling a jobs framework. And that would be a kind of an attempt to limit the ability of bosses to stand down workers and to seek redundancies and to direct them to take leave. So a limitation on those things. And another thing that they would try to do would be to ensure that the books are open so that we can see what the actual finances are of the university, and to make sure that they're cutting things like discretionary spending on building and things as opposed to wages. But at the same time, what's I guess most concerning about that, at least for me, I've been arguing against the national executive's tactics from the beginning, that they're essentially still accepting that we're going to have to make some pretty major concessions that it's very unlikely we're going to be able to see rolled back in time. But that's what's happening. So the jobs framework is endorsed by the National Council. They're going to be seeking to get that put in place. And then at the same time, members will have to vote on it, and there'll be sort of local committees that'll be able to discuss it and vote on it. So there is a major national campaign at the moment to vote against what the national executive has put up. So it's a no concessions campaign that's pretty organised. So what's going on sort of outside the national executive area? So we've got a pretty serious situation on the ground. Like, if I can talk just a little bit about Sydney University, but this would be indicative of what's going on across the country in universities. So we're seeing, for instance, the fact that in the Faculty of Arts, for instance, at Sydney University, a huge faculty, they're trying to cut about 30% of the units. So the idea would be to cut back on almost a third of the units, and therefore to essentially move permanent staff into teaching the subjects that casuals and fixed term staff would normally teach, so to try and drag their budget for casuals back to zero. So we've got hundreds, if not thousands, of casual staff members looking at unemployment by the time the end of semester rolls around. So they're in a serious situation as far as that's concerned. And I guess the thing to point out there is that the national executive strategy simply cannot respond to the needs of casuals and cannot protect the people like casuals, the most vulnerable sector of the workforce there. So in a sense, that's kind of speaks against the strategy that they've gone for. Things that have been happening at the very least to try and push back against these things have been organisations of major petitions, pledging for permanent staff to not do work that would otherwise be done by casuals. There's organising work that's going on at a local level for the National Day of Action. So the NTEU as a whole has endorsed a National Day of Action for May 21. So both the National Executive and others. So that's happening. But I guess, I'm sort of not bringing great news. I suppose I'm bringing news from the front lines of a really difficult situation, because the mechanisms that we have to push back, for instance, against hundreds, if not thousands, of casuals at Sydney University, but tens of thousands probably across the country, losing their jobs.
Okay, good.
We don't particularly have many.
What, Mama?
The NTEU has said from the very beginning, its national executive has made many gestures towards the impossibility of industrial action, how irresponsible it would be. We've seen officials come round to branch meetings and give this sort of message. So there's been a lot of attempt, I think, by the summit of the union, so to speak, to kind of control and tame some of the actions of rank and file members. Look, things are not over. There are things that are happening. There is the continuation of petitions. There are video actions that are being put together. There are open letters that are being put out there. There are discussions around things like we can do marking bans and sort of to try and do something that looks like industrial action, but really isn't. Casuals are in an interesting position here, because in one sense they could sort of de facto strike, but at the same time, the university is not looking to even have them as employees next semester. So at that level, the industrial strength of casuals themselves is in a sense weakened. So look, there are other people here who are from Sydney and who might be able to add a couple of things about the situation, about the NTEU as a whole. But I guess I'm speaking to a situation where we have seen the NTEU, at least the National Executive, act to thwart or to how would I say, like to put a brake on some of the more radical actions that have come up from the base of the union, and things are sort of still hanging in the balance. The test will be whether or not rank and file members vote for the jobs framework that presumably the NTEU will negotiate with bosses. So that will be a sort of a test of whether rank and file members are still against the unions, the upper echelons of the union strategy, and I guess we'll see what happens after that. But yeah, other autonomous organising activities are going on within the union itself to try and prepare for that. So look, basically that's all I have to say. Hope I didn't take too long, but yeah, happy to take questions of course later on, but also for others to fill in things if there are details that I've missed. And I guess I'm sorry to not bring you wholly good news about the situation.
Thanks very much for that, Rob. Really excellent to hear about the about what's going on at, well, not excellent to hear about the attacks, but excellent to know that that people are organising to fight back at Sydney Uni. The universities have been a really important front in during this entire crisis, and it was excellent to see quite a few NTEU members at the May 1 car convoy last week. So well done to those people for getting down there, and for everyone else that that was involved in organising it. Unfortunately, I've just been told that Alex Sewell from the UWU is unable to make it. He's been called into a dispute. But that will leave us with a little bit more time for discussion and for questions for our speakers. So yeah, we will come back to Rob at the end of discussion as well. But for now, I'll pass it on to Lucy Honan.
Thanks, Caitlin, and thanks, Rob, for that. So I'm a teacher. I'm a high school teacher in Melbourne and a Solidarity member. And I was going to talk a little bit about teachers during the crisis and the way that we've been made to pay for it. But I also wanted to talk a little bit more generally about the class tensions and both the offensive that the bosses are on, but also the possibilities that workers do have in terms of fighting back during the crisis. So I guess to start off with, teachers, like workers everywhere, have been made to pay for the corona crisis. It's been a very public bleeding process as well. We've hoisted the entire education system onto the internet in a space of weeks. Most of us are working very, very long, anxious hours online on a very hostile terrain with edu-business platforms like Google Classrooms, trying to keep kids in contact with the education system. Our workload problems before the crisis were out of control, and they've only increased recently with the online business. Governments have shown us extreme contempt. Morrison publicly and hypocritically has been suggesting that we and our apparent passion for online learning is what's been holding back kids and education, and particularly disadvantaged kids. This is from the government that's responsible for ensuring that a given private school will be funded more public money than a public school of the equivalent demographic. It's very galling. The whole thing feels like a massive punch in the gut that we've just taken. And the fact that they've expected us to do all of this, to jump through these hoops, to make it work, to make the impossible actually work, despite the inequalities, despite the lack of resourcing, despite the lack of time, the lack of professional autonomy, and the fundamental limitations of online learning. And governments just announcing that it will happen, teachers working themselves sick to do it, and then just announcing that it won't be happening anymore. You know, via media telling people that kind of mad hybrid situations of online and offline, in classroom and not in classroom, will be what's expected, and teachers, you know, are screaming that it's impossible, and yet governments are expecting it to happen. there's a direct connection between teachers' reluctance and mistrust about going back to school and the contemptuous way we've been treated for years, particularly during this crisis. And I think there's a large part of people's resistance just being like, we don't want to be pushed around anymore. We can't be pushed around anymore. Our bosses, so education department bosses and principals, like bosses everywhere, have been seizing the moment, not just to make us pay for the crisis, but to push through their terrible managerial dreams. In Queensland, there's been a 12-month pay freeze just announced for teachers in Queensland. In New South Wales, the education department has rolled over the same appalling staffing conditions that have made this crisis so impossible to manage. In Victoria, casual relief teachers, canteen staff have just been sacked without any notice, despite the fact that their wages have been budgeted for, and there's no loss for each kind of independent public school in terms of income that they could be paying for these people, but they're not. And of course, it's across the economy. It's not just teachers. We've seen in the fast food sector, the bosses, shamefully with the help of the SDA and the ACTU, have gone after the award conditions of fast food workers so that bosses have more control over workers' time. People who are working from home are now experiencing the hell of surveillance models that have been tested on workers who have been working at home for a long time, but now many of us are experiencing it. You can't see who's watching you, and that little dot of light, I feel like, is a bit of torture. The accountability administrivia is insane, and as we just heard from Rob, the kind of cuts they can get away with in education by turning things online, by recording lectures, by recording things that shouldn't be recorded, or trying to mechanise things that can't be mechanised is through the roof. And while it feels like we've just been taking body blows, it can be easy to miss how much power, and in some instances actually substantially increased power, we do actually have to resist. Firstly, I think there is a recognition or a kind of a revelation for many of us that we need to hold on to and constantly point to the money, that the government has money, and the artificiality all along of the budget restraints that they kept holding us under. It's always been a lie that there wasn't enough money to raise New Start, make childcare free, to underwrite wages. But now the lie is there for all of us to see that when it came to saving capitalism, it turns out that Morrison could find the dough, and not just the dough, but the power to swiftly intervene to change the unchangeable. Private hospitals could be commandeered. People's wages could be bailed out to the tunes of billions of dollars. Renters could be slightly better protected from eviction. Whole systems could be reorganised to momentarily protect people's health in a partial way when the future of the economy depended on it, or when their profits depended on it. Of course, and what we've been saying all along is that it's not good enough, that, JobKeeper doesn't extend to enough people. It doesn't include a job guarantee, and job sector doubling, the fact that it's not supposed to last is appalling. It's clearly been about bailing capitalism out of a crisis and not about reorienting permanently to health before profit. But the working class has been witness to the fact that it has happened and that it can happen. This turning on of the taps and making what was supposed to be impossible into a possibility is really, really important. McManus has been pointing out, for example, recently, that the money is there to extend to all migrants and all casuals. And that's been very important. I think we need to do the same. We can keep saying there's money for the climate jobs, there's money for unemployed people who live with dignity, there's money for childcare, free childcare to continue properly under better conditions for the workers. The money's there for the universities, and we shouldn't let anyone forget it. I think the other thing, there are a couple of other things, but one of the more revealing moments in the whole crisis was when Morrison, under a bit of pressure, was talking about the fact that all workers are essential workers, and it was a bit of a revelation as well. He owned up to the fact that, when he was asking who counts when they were trying to decide who was let out of the house or who was allowed to go to school or whatever new rule they were making up. Who counts as essential? And he said every worker is essential, and I think they mean it. The ruling class's profits rely on us. The economy isn't tanking because the bosses are staying at home. It's tanking because we are. people like cleaners, farm workers, childcare workers, transport workers, supermarket workers. We've all had extraordinary power all along, but right now, and we've seen it from the battles from the NUW, and presumably Alex is out there fighting that particular fight, or one of those particular fights at the moment, but we have always had this power. We've always been essential to their profits. They need us. And I think we can be aware of that at the moment. And that's true for teachers too. We are essential for the bosses. They have been whinging and whinging and whinging about the fact that we're not at work. You know, and it's because both the fact that we take care of kids during the day so that parents can go to work and get exploited, and also because we're turning kids into useful workers, and they want that. They need us to do it. They go absolutely spare when we don't. So that's a power that we need to recognise that we have. But the crisis has always also opened up the opportunity and the urgency around prosecuting our working class perspective about what's essential about our work and what is essentially bullshit. In the context of a crisis, it turns out, for example, in the world of teaching, that NAPLAN was never essential. We never needed it to work out how our students were going. The holy grail of assessment data that the entire education system, we have been told, has been totally dependent on. We couldn't pick it up unless we had a substitute. And how would we know that teachers were working unless we had it? It turns out that we didn't need it at all. And so much of our work, because we've had to redesign the whole thing, has been put under this test of what's essential. What do we actually need to do during a pandemic, and what do we not need to do, and who gets to decide it? And I've been in lots of ferocious union meetings lately about that very question, and people insisting, for example, that we don't need to mark the roll when we're not in the room. There's no duty of care at the moment, or things like this. As one of a teacher at my school said, really, really angrily, we need to be trusted to decide what's important to do right now, and we need to be trusted to do it. And I think that's also an argument that's happening all across the working class at the moment, as we're kind of in this existential moment about what work has to be done and in what way and who gets to decide. Overall, I think the class lines are much clearer for all to see, and they've been drawn quite sharply. Union officials across the entire union movement are reporting a jump in membership as people realise they need our working class organisations to protect us, both in terms of health and livelihood. Despite what Morrison says, there's a gut instinct that many people know that we're not all in this together and that we need our unions to protect us. It's an existential question. So unions are in a much stronger position. You know, Sally McManus is centre stage of Australian politics. Angelo Gavriliadis, the head of the New South Wales Teachers Federation, is, you know, front and centre all the time. Long profile pieces about him, and the same is true for a lot of our union leaderships. They're much higher profile at the moment. And as Rob, I think, really importantly pointed to, union membership can't just accept whatever deals are brokered on our behalf right now. It's really important that the rank and file are active and fighting for what we need, particularly because there won't be a snapback for the economy, no matter how much it's been talked about. The bosses know that, and they are preparing to escalate their offensive. The state governments are preparing wage freezes. The Morrison government is preparing to wind back everything that we kind of momentarily experienced. Fair work is making it easier to sack people. The cuts are going to come in, and the job losses are going to continue. We need to exercise our power. And the May 1 car convoy stopping traffic in the city in Sydney was a real inspiration, definitely from Melbourne. It was very exciting to watch. It showed that despite the restrictions, we can still put a spanner in the works, we can still raise our demands. And as I think the absence of Alex points to right now, unions are fighting very, very hard right now. Whether it's live or online or in any particular way that they can, we have to be fighting, and everybody kind of feels it and knows it. Whether it's about the conditions now, whether it's about the terms of a return to work, or whether it's about what business we're returning to, what as usual is going to look like, on whose terms is it going to be decided. So in this situation, we need to recognise that power that we do have, despite all the offensive, despite the losses. People, you know, kids don't educate themselves, as it turns out, and there's only so much that Google Classrooms can do without a teacher cranking its wheels, and the same is true at universities too. somebody has to mark the assignments, somebody has to speak to people, somebody has to share the knowledge and information and prosecute, you know, the arguments and do the research. And so I think there's a you know, a desperation in this situation that we're in, but also I think very, very important to realise that we do have power and we can fight and we need to fight.
Thanks very much, Lucy, and also to Rob once again. And yeah, apologies that we didn't have our UWU speaker. They have been really leading the way in a way to stand up, particularly for the rights of migrants who have been entirely left off all of the coronavirus benefits and protections. They've also been you know, workers with the UWU have been staging walkouts over health and safety questions and PPE gear during this crisis. So they are also, you know, a really important part of this struggle. So I'll get people to raise their hands if you can use the raise hand function, and I'll just keep a little list. Try to keep your contributions to 2.5 minutes. I'll write to you privately if you're going on too long. So first up, I've got Marcus Banks.
Yeah, hi. I'm just outside. I'm NTEU member from RMIT University, and thanks, Robert, for a great talk. We just have to stress some things. 3,500 people have joined the NTEU in the last month. The industry, if you want to call it that, employs 250,000 workers. And no matter about the ideological stuff that the government's putting up at the moment about JobKeeper and the universities, the university sector is a massively important element of Australian capitalism. And we need to see, as socialists and activists, that this is a crucial opportunity to seize the moment right now, because in the next 12 months, the trade union movement can be reinvigorated and can be galvanised in a way it hasn't for many years. There's been thousands of members on Zoom meetings. There's been dozens of groups, Facebook groups being set up, all asking, what are we going to do? And I think that we need to realise from our perspective that the key thing is for activity, for people to take action and to move towards industrial action in the next few months. And how do we do that? It was ideas from a Solidarity member, Jasmine Ali, for the National Day of Action. She was the one, and we pushed that through branch committees. We pushed that through, and we've got the National Executive supporting that. It was our idea in Solidarity to call for an open letter to push the Vice-Chancellor to say that they weren't going to harass people turning up to the National Day of Action. Now, these sort of ideas are ways of encouraging and building workplace meetings for people to do things. And it stands against the other strategy, which is simply to say, vote no. Great, that's a position. We can support that, but it's only a position. It's not a strategy. It's not a way of actually building from below for building unions and building for what's going to be happening in the next 12 months. We're going to be back out physically on May the 21st. The NTEU officials, unfortunately, are only talking about a radiothon, but now we've got the Victorian Division Secretary, Mel Slee, supporting car convoys. Thank you very much, May 1st, Sydney. Pushing on those ideas, we need to get those small cogs working to larger cogs, and we can influence the officials. There's no point just bagging the officials And there's no point in just going along with the officials. Socialists shouldn't do either. We should be working with the officials in things that we can support and campaigning against them on things that we can't. And we have to work out a strategy to do that. And the RMIT Branch Committee is just starting to realise how that strategy can work. And they're now talking about workplace meetings to bill for the National Day of Action. And that strategic approach, I think, is so important for socialists to grab, because it's going to be the test when we get back physically at the universities to build it. Because the small groups of people that come along to the small picket lines out that RMIT is organising, socially distanced, they will be the new delegates. They will be the new activists. They will be the people in the next 12 months that will reinvigorate this union in a way it has never seen before. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcus. I've got Danny Cotton next, and the list is wide open after Danny, so feel free to ask questions as well.
Cool. Sorry to sound like a broken record, but I think Marcus is spot on. And we've been finding the similar thing in the, I'm a PhD student at the Sydney University. We've just been talking about what we're going to do, like as some of the student groups and stuff about this, the attack on education. And I think Marcus's thing sounds dead obvious when he says it like that, because it is dead obvious. Like, we can stop these education attacks, but it's going to take an actual fight on our front. But I think it isn't necessarily obvious to people why we shouldn't do those things. So I guess we've had a similar argument come up in our thing saying, oh, you know, this is basically just a left cover for the officials. You know, if you're taking action, you're hiding the lines, the class lines that exist between you and the officials, and this kind of, we're the real radicals, don't worry. And I think speaking against the necessity of taking action for that reason, which I think just gets it totally the wrong way around. Like, it makes no sense to me. But the idea that, like, I think the reality is, if we can get the officials to endorse taking action, that's great. If they're not going to endorse the action, we're going to go ahead with it anyway. But I think the idea that we should let proving how against we are the officials mean that we don't end up taking action, or we don't have an in-person convoy, or we don't have a thing. If we take this approach, we're never going to fight for jobs, never going to fight to stop the education cuts. So I think it's really important for us to kind of talk about that. And I guess, to my mind, I see a bit of a symmetrical thing, because on the one side, there's these people saying, don't take action, we just need to prove how radical we are. And then on the other hand, we've got people like Christina Keneally, who are saying that we don't need to be taking action to stop the cuts on the jobs. Instead, what we need to be doing is cutting down on migration. Now, I really think this is just crazy. We're existing in the education sector where the fact that they've done all these border closures, told the international students to go home, people are getting kicked out of their houses, and as a result of all of this, we're having these massive job losses, 30% of courses cut, all of this because we've seen how essential migrants are to the operation of our everyday life in our tutorials and everything else. They want to say that instead of fighting for those jobs, instead of putting up that fight, we're just going to say, oh, we're going to block immigration, and that's going to somehow lead to anything happening. I just see it as both of them are ways to say we don't need to take action, and we do need to take up, you know, these things. And I've been quite disappointed. There's been a lot of people quite silent